When the hikers found the partially buried body on August 12, 2011, they knew immediately it wasn't an accident. The shallow grave, the missing gear, the deliberate attempt to hide what had been done to someone who trusted the wrong person on the trail. Scott Lilly, trail name Stonewall, was 30 years old from South Bend, Indiana. A Civil War buff, a gentle soul working through depression and personal struggles, hiking the Appalachian Trail from Maryland to Georgia as a form of therapy, a way to find himself. His pastor had introduced him to the trail, thought it would help. His family thought he was safe out there in the wilderness, away from the dangers of urban life, away from the things that had been weighing him down. They were wrong. The last confirmed sighting was July 31st at the Priest Shelter in Nelson County, Virginia. Scott had stayed there overnight, signed the trail register, chatted with other hikers about the beauty of the climb, the views from the summit. He'd been planning to hike 3.8 miles north to US Route 60, then hitch into Buena Vista for supplies, food, propane, maybe a shower and a hot meal at a diner. Standard thru-hiker resupply. He'd done it dozens of times before at other trail towns. He never made it to Route 60. Instead, his body turned up 2 weeks later near Cow Camp Gap Shelter, buried in a shallow grave just off the hotel trail. The trail is popular, a 5.8-mile loop easily accessible from nearby roads, used by day hikers and section hikers. Not remote, not isolated, not the kind of place you'd expect to find a murder victim. Which means his killer either didn't care about being seen, or knew exactly when the trail would be empty, knew the patterns, knew how to move unseen. The FBI was called in immediately. Special Agent Steve Watson led the investigation. They found over 100 pieces of evidence at the scene and along nearby trails. They interviewed 83 people across multiple states and 2 foreign countries, fellow hikers, trail angels, hostel owners, anyone who might have seen Scott between July 31st and August 12th. They covered 270 miles of trails, checking every shelter register, every trailhead camera, every lead. But here's what they didn't find. Scott's blue or purple backpack, the one other hikers would have recognized, his Ozark Trail hiking shoes, well-worn, distinctive, his propane camping stove, his Appalachian Trail handbook annotated with notes and sketches, a Nintendo DS game he carried for entertainment in shelters, most of his clothing. His body was stripped of gear so thoroughly it looked like robbery, but nothing valuable was actually taken, just the things that would identify him as a thru-hiker, that would let him blend in on the trail. Think about what that means. The medical examiner's report was clear: asphyxia by suffocation. He was strangled, murdered, then partially buried about half a mile from the trail, 2.5 miles from the nearest road, in a location someone had to know about, someone who understood the area, someone who'd scouted it. Someone killed Scott Lilly and took their time doing it. Someone who knew the area well enough to bury him in a spot that wouldn't be immediately discovered. Someone who then carried his gear away, or worse, wore it, putting on Scott's identity like a costume, blending in as just another hiker on the trail. Think about that. Scott's killer might have walked past other hikers wearing Scott's backpack, his shoes, might have stayed in shelters, signed trail logs under a false name, shared meals around campfires with people who had no idea they were sitting across from a murderer. Might have accepted trail magic from kind strangers, accepted rides into town, accepted trust from a community built on trust. The Appalachian Trail community was shaken. For decades, the trail had been one of the safest places in America. Since 1974, only 11 hikers had been murdered on the entire 2,190-mile trail. It was statistically safer than any city. Solo hikers, especially women, had felt relatively secure because of the close-knit community, the constant flow of familiar faces, the trail angels, and shelter communities that looked out for each other. But Scott's murder changed that calculus. If someone could be strangled and buried on a popular trail section without anyone seeing anything, then nowhere was truly safe. The FBI looked at trail registers, talked to everyone known as Papa Smurf, a hiker of interest mentioned in online forums who'd been in the area around the same time. They checked every lead that came in after the $10,000 reward was offered. They investigated a known sex offender who'd been camping nearby. They looked at fellow thru-hikers who'd left the trail abruptly around the time of Scott's death. Nothing stuck. No arrests, no suspect publicly named. Here's what terrifies me about this case, what keeps me up at night. The Appalachian Trail is built on trust. It has to be. You're out there for months, vulnerable, exhausted, dependent on the kindness of strangers. You share shelters with people you've just met. You accept rides from locals. You trust that the person hiking behind you isn't a threat. You trust that the community will protect you. But Scott's killer exploited that trust, got close enough to overpower him, not an easy feat as Scott was a fit 30-year-old man, close enough to strangle him without anyone hearing the struggle, close enough to steal his identity as a hiker and disappear into the very community Scott thought would keep him safe. Since 1974, only 11 hikers have been murdered on the Appalachian Trail over a 47-year period. Those statistics don't help Scott's family. They don't explain why their son, who was hiking to heal from depression, to find peace, to reconnect with himself, found a predator instead. They don't explain why his final journal entry, written at the priest shelter, was so hopeful, talking about the beauty of the mountains, the kindness of fellow hikers, how much better he was feeling. The FBI says they haven't given up. Special Agent Watson still works the case when new leads come in. They're still hoping for that one call, that one tip, that breaks everything open. But it's been over 13 years now. Trails grow cold, memories fade, witnesses die or move on. The killer might be dead themselves by now, taking the truth to their grave. Or maybe they're still out there. Maybe they quit the trail after that, spooked by the investigation, by the attention. Maybe the guilt finally caught up. Or maybe, and this is the nightmare scenario, maybe they're still hiking, still blending in, still wearing someone else's gear, still waiting for the next isolated hiker who trusts too easily, who's hiking alone, who's vulnerable in just the right way. So if you're planning to hike the AT, be smart. Tell people your plans, check in regularly. Don't trust everyone you meet, no matter how friendly they seem. Don't share too much personal information in shelter registers. Don't hike alone if you can help it. And if something feels wrong, if someone gives you bad vibes, if a situation doesn't sit right, trust that instinct. Because somewhere between the priest shelter and Cow Camp Gap, Scott Lilly trusted the wrong person. Maybe he accepted help with his gear. Maybe he shared a campfire. Maybe he thought he'd made a trail friend. And it cost him everything. We found the dirt road purely by accident. 3 of us on motorcycles, cutting through mountain valleys in Colorado on our way to a rally in Denver. James was on his Harley, Sarah on her Indian, and me on a Triumph that I'd spent 2 years rebuilding in my garage. The plan had been simple. Take the scenic route, camp under the stars, arrive fashionably late with stories of adventure. We'd been riding for hours when James's bike started making a noise, a grinding, metal-on-metal sound that made us all wince. We pulled over and he popped the hood, diagnosed the problem loose chain and fixed it in 15 minutes. But during that stop, Sarah spotted the road. Look at that! It was barely visible through the overgrowth, a dirt path cutting between 2 massive pines leading deeper into the valley. No sign, no marker, just a road that looked like it had been forgotten by time. "Wonder where it goes," James said, wiping grease off his hands. I should have said no, should have insisted we stick to the plan. But there's something about being on a bike, about the freedom of the open road, that makes you stupid, makes you think every path is an adventure waiting to happen. "Let's find out," I said. The road was rough, rougher than any road should be if it's still being used. Branches scraped our helmets, and more than once I had to navigate around fallen logs that had been there so long they'd started decomposing into the earth. We rode for maybe 20 minutes, going deeper into the mountains, the path getting narrower and darker. Then the trees opened up, and we saw it. A town. Not ruins, a town. Intact buildings with walls and roofs, though many were boarded up. A main street with stores that still had signs hanging: Johnson's General Store, Pete's Bar, Mountain View Pharmacy. Cars, ancient ones, 50s models, sat rusting in parking spaces, their tires long since rotted away. But it was the sculptures that made us stop. They were everywhere. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Twisted figures made from scrap metal, welded together in shapes that hurt to look at. Animals with too many legs, humans with elongated limbs and heads bent at impossible angles. Things that weren't quite either, abominations of jagged edges and hollow eyes. "What the hell is this?" Sarah's voice crackled through our helmet radios. We killed our engines and climbed off the bikes. The silence was immediate and total. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the faint creaking of metal on metal as one of the sculptures shifted slightly on its base. I walked up to the nearest one, a dog, I thought, or maybe a wolf. It was made from car parts, fenders for ribs, a bumper for the spine, headlights for eyes. Those eyes, despite being nothing but glass and rust, seemed to track me as I circled it. "This is someone's art project," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Has to be." "Creepy art project," Sarah murmured. We wandered down the main street, peering into dusty windows. Some stores still had merchandise on the shelves, cans so old their labels had faded to white, boxes that crumbled when I tapped the glass. In the pharmacy, I could see a calendar on the wall, October 1952. "This place has been empty for over 70 years, I said. "Then who made the sculptures?" Sarah asked. Good question, because the sculptures didn't look 70 years old. The metal was rusted, yes, but the welds looked newer. Some of them were made from modern car parts. I recognized a Honda logo on one, a Tesla emblem on another. We made our way to the center of town, where a fountain sat dry and filled with dead leaves. More sculptures surrounded it. These were bigger, more elaborate, and more disturbing. They formed a circle, all facing inward, like they were attending some kind of meeting or preparing for some kind of ritual. "I don't like this," Sarah said. "We should go." I agreed. We all did. But as we turned to head back to our bikes, we heard it. An engine. Not a motorcycle, something heavier. The sound came from the far end of town, from a street we hadn't explored yet. We stood frozen, listening as it grew louder, closer. Then it appeared through the fog that had started rolling in, because of course there was fog now, even though there hadn't been 10 minutes ago. A tractor. Old John Deere, green paint flaking off in sheets. But it was what was mounted on the front that made my blood freeze. A deer's head. Severed, decayed, but somehow still intact. Its antlers were wrapped in chains, rusty chains that dragged behind the tractor, scraping against the cracked pavement with a sound like grinding teeth. And there was no driver. The tractor trundled forward on its own, engine chugging, belching black smoke. It turned onto the main street, heading straight toward us. "Go!" James hissed. "Go, go, go!" We ran. Later, I'd be embarrassed about it. 3 experienced riders, scared off by a driverless tractor. But in that moment, with that deer's head swaying as the tractor bounced over potholes, with those chains scraping and that engine growling, in that moment, running was the only thing that made sense. We got to our bikes, kick-started them with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped mine. The engines roared to life, beautiful and loud and real. We didn't look back as we raced down that dirt road, branches whipping at us, rocks spitting out from under our tires. We didn't stop until we hit the main highway, until we were surrounded by normal traffic and normal people and normal reality. Only then did we pull over, strip off our helmets, and try to process what we'd seen. "Did that really just happen?" Sarah's face was pale. "The tractor," James said. "There had to be a driver. We just couldn't see them from where we were standing." "And the sculptures?" "Art installation. Like I said, some eccentric artist bought a ghost town and turned it into an outdoor gallery." I wanted to believe him, wanted it to be that simple, but when I pulled out my phone to mark the location, to look it up later, I found nothing. No road, no town, just green forest unbroken for miles. "That's impossible," I said, showing them. We compared our GPS histories. All 3 showed the same thing, a straight path from where we'd started to where we were now. No detour, no dirt road, no ghost town. "We all saw it," Sarah said. "All three of us. That makes it real." But did it? Because when we tried to find it again, and we did try, drove back to the spot where we'd turned off, there was no road. Just trees, thick and old and undisturbed. That was 2 years ago. I still ride, still take back roads, but I never explore anymore. Never follow unmarked paths into valleys that seem too quiet, too still. Because I know the truth now. Some towns exist outside the normal flow of things. Some places are pocket dimensions, bubbles of wrongness that occasionally intersect with our world. And some art isn't made by human hands. It's made by whatever lurks in those forgotten places. And it's watching, waiting, for the next riders foolish enough to wander off the beaten path. The gas gauge had been on empty for 5 miles when I finally saw the sign. Population 217. I didn't catch the town's name. The wooden marker was so weathered that the letters had faded into ghost impressions, barely distinguishable from the grain. But I didn't care about the name. I cared about the gas station that appeared half a mile later, sitting at the intersection of the only 2 roads this forgotten place had to offer. It was the kind of building that made you think of black and white photographs. Single pump, corrugated metal roof sagging in the middle, windows so filthy they looked frosted. I pulled up, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment, listening to the tick, tick, tick of cooling metal. That's when I saw the child. Pale, bald, maybe 7 years old, maybe 70, it was impossible to tell. They stood at the window, hands pressed against the glass, staring at me with eyes too large for their face, not blinking, not moving, just staring. I raised my hand in a small wave, trying for friendly. The child's mouth opened in a silent scream, and they disappeared from the window so fast it was like someone had yanked them backwards by an invisible rope. My hand was still raised when the engine of my rational mind started sputtering. "This is wrong. Everything about this is wrong." But I needed gas, and the next town was God knows how many miles away on fumes I didn't have. The pump was ancient, the kind where you had to go inside and prepay. I walked to the door, pushed it open, heard a bell jingle, a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the heavy silence. The store was empty. Shelves stocked with dusty cans that looked like they'd been there since the Reagan administration. A register that was probably older than me. And no one, not the child, not anyone. I waited 30 seconds, cleared my throat, called out, "Hello?" Nothing. I left $20 on the counter and went back outside to pump. The fuel was slow, the numbers on the ancient display rolling over with arthritic reluctance. As I waited, I looked around. The whole town felt like a stage set. Houses that should have had people in them but didn't, a church with a crooked steeple and no cars in its lot, a park with swings that moved in the breezeless air, and the diner. Pat's Diner, according to the neon sign that buzzed and flickered despite it being 2 in the afternoon. It sat on the opposite corner, a chrome-sided relic that belonged in a different decade. Through the windows I could see people. Lots of people. My stomach growled. I'd been driving for 6 hours on nothing but gas station coffee and adrenaline. The pump clicked off 12 gallons, which meant the gauge had been lying about how empty I really was. I screwed the cap back on and looked at the diner again. Packed. Every booth filled, people at the counter, the kind of crowd you'd expect on Sunday after church, not Tuesday at 2 p.m. I should have gotten back in my car, should have driven away and never looked back. But hunger has a way of overriding instinct, and besides, lots of people meant normal, right? You don't get a bustling diner in a town full of monsters. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and every single person stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths, conversations died mid-syllable, coffee cups paused in mid-sip. 50+ people, all turning to look at me with the kind of coordinated precision you only see in rehearsed performances. The silence was so complete I could hear the hum of the ancient air conditioner, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, the thud of my own heartbeat. No one smiled, no one frowned, they just stared. Farmers in overalls, families with children, old men in suspenders, all frozen, all watching, all waiting. I tried to smile. "Hi, I'm just..." "What do you want here?" The voice came from my right. I turned and saw her. She sat at the counter, coffee cup in front of her, wearing 2 eye patches over where her eyes should have been. Not 1, 2. One over each socket, like someone had very carefully decided to cover the absence where sight should have lived. She was old, ancient maybe, skin like crumpled paper, hair white as bone, back bent into a question mark. But it was her voice that made my bladder clench, raspy and wet, like words being dragged up from underwater, from somewhere voices shouldn't be able to come from. I just wanted to get some lunch." She turned her head toward me with mechanical precision. Without eyes, I shouldn't have been able to tell she was looking at me, but I could feel it. The weight of that eyeless gaze, boring into me like augers. "We don't serve your kind here." "My kind?" I almost laughed, almost asked what kind that was, the hungry kind, the lost kind. But something in the quality of the silence stopped me. Because everyone was still staring, and now I noticed details I'd missed. The way some people's mouths were hanging open just slightly. The way that little girl in the corner booth had stopped crying mid-sob, tears frozen on her cheeks. The way the cook behind the counter had a spatula raised like he was about to flip something, but nothing was on the grill. They weren't eating. They were pretending to eat. This whole scene, it was a performance, a trap. "I'll just go," I said, backing toward the door. "You'll just go," the eyeless woman repeated, and her lips curled into something that might have been a smile if smiles were supposed to have that many teeth. "That's what they all say, before, after." She tilted her head and I heard her neck crack like old wood. After, they usually scream. The diner erupted into motion. Everyone stood at once, chairs scraping back in perfect unison. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard amplified through a megaphone. They didn't rush at me. That would have been almost better. Instead, they just stood there, blocking every aisle, every path to the door except the one I'd come through. I ran, hit the door so hard the glass rattled, sprinted across the street to my car, fumbled with the keys, dropped them, picked them up, got the door open, got inside, locked it, started the engine, all while watching the diner through the windshield. They stood at the windows, all of them, pressed against the glass like the child at the gas station had been, watching me with expressions that ranged from hunger to curiosity to something I couldn't name. The eyeless woman was in the center, her head tracking my movement despite her lack of sight. I threw the car into reverse, then drive, then I was racing down the 2-lane highway, putting miles between me and that place. I didn't slow down until my hands stopped shaking, until the town was 30 minutes behind me. When I finally pulled over at a real rest stop, one with multiple cars and families and normal people doing normal things, I grabbed my phone to mark the location, to warn others, to do something. But when I looked at the GPS history, there was just a straight line. No detours, no stops, just the highway uninterrupted. That town with a population of 217, according to my phone, it had never existed. I drove the rest of the way home with my doors locked and my windows up despite the heat, and every time I pass through a small town now, I don't stop. I don't look at the diners no matter how inviting they seem. I don't wave at children in windows. Because I learned something that day. Some places exist between the cracks of maps. Some populations aren't listed because they don't want to be found. And some diners don't serve food. They serve something else entirely. And if you're unlucky enough to walk through their door, well, you might just become what's on the menu. The loggers found the skull first, then realized it was small, too small. And that's when the true horror began. April 1985, Campbell County, Tennessee. Remote woods above Elk Valley, accessible only by 4-wheel drive on a rutted coal-hauling road called Sand Gap Road. This wasn't a place you stumbled into by accident. Someone had to know it was there. Someone had to deliberately drive up that mountain, far from prying eyes, bouncing over rocks and through creek beds, to dump what they'd done where no one would ever look. A child's skull, partially buried in the red Tennessee clay. Scattered nearby in the leaf litter, finger bones, ribs, fragments of vertebrae, 2 high-top sneakers size 5 or 6, canvas worn but still recognizable, a cheap plastic necklace with colored beads, and silence, the kind that presses on your eardrums until you hear your own heartbeat. Dr. Bill Bass from the University of Tennessee's Body Farm examined the remains with the careful precision that had made him a legend in forensic anthropology. Female, age 9 to 15, dead at least a year, possibly longer. Good dental work. Someone had cared for her once, taken her to a dentist, filled cavities, maintained her health. But no one was looking for her. No missing persons reports matched her description. It was as if she'd never existed, as if she'd been erased. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation called her Baby Girl because she deserved a name, even if they didn't know it. They wrote to 50 dentists across Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina, hoping someone would recognize the dental work, the specific pattern of fillings. Silence. They checked every missing child report within 200 miles, then 300, then across the entire Southeast. Nothing matched. They released sketches of what she might have looked like based on skull reconstruction. No one called. Here's what they did find. Isotopic testing of her remains showed she hadn't grown up in Tennessee. The mineral content in her bones, the signature of the water she'd drunk, the food she'd eaten, it all pointed elsewhere. Somewhere they couldn't pinpoint. Somewhere north, maybe. Somewhere with different geology, different water sources. She was a stranger, dumped in woods so isolated the nearest human being lived miles down the mountain. Investigators kept her skull in evidence storage. They kept her necklace, the cloth fragments animals hadn't dragged away, the sneakers. They waited. For nearly 40 years, they waited for someone to come forward, for technology to catch up, for a break that seemed like it would never come. Then in 2022, advanced DNA technology and genetic genealogy gave them an answer. Tracy Sue Walker, 15, from Lafayette, Indiana, missing since June 1978, 7 years before her bones turned up 400 miles away in those Campbell County woods. But the answer only deepened the horror, opened new wounds, created more questions than it solved. How did Tracy get from Indiana to Tennessee? The distance alone suggests planning, transportation, intent. Someone drove her across state lines, either while she was alive and terrified, or already dead and wrapped in something that left no forensic trace. How long had she been dead before she was buried on that mountain? The decomposition suggested at least a year, possibly longer. Who knew about that impossibly remote logging road? And why did no one in Elk Valley, a tight-knit Appalachian community where everybody knows everybody, where strangers stand out like neon signs, ever see a young girl who didn't belong? TBI Special Agent Brandon Elkins has worked the case for years. Secrets tend to stay in the hills, he said in a 2022 interview. Appalachian communities are close, they protect their own. We need help. Someone knows something. Think about it, for Tracy to end up where she did, someone had to know that logging road intimately. Someone who could navigate it in the dark or in bad weather, who understood the terrain, who knew exactly how remote it was, who knew that loggers might not come through for months or even years. This wasn't random. This wasn't panic. This was calculated. This was someone who'd thought about where to hide a body, someone who'd maybe done it before. And here's the truly chilling part. Tracy wasn't the only one. In January 1985, just 3 months before Tracy's skull was discovered, another young woman was found dead on I-75 near Jellicoe, just miles from where Tracy lay buried. Strangled, pregnant, unidentified. The area became a dumping ground for what investigators called the Redhead Murders, a series of unsolved killings of young women with reddish hair found along interstates throughout the 1980s. Victims discovered in Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, Pennsylvania. Some identified eventually, most still nameless. Tracy had light brown hair. She didn't fit the pattern, which means whoever killed her might have been someone else entirely. Or it means the pattern was broader than investigators realized. Someone who knew the back roads, someone who traveled, someone who understood how to make young girls disappear. Tracy's mother, Pat Walker, had spent 44 years not knowing what happened to her daughter. Tracy had simply vanished one summer day in Lafayette. No body, no leads, no closure, just gone. When Agent Elkins called Pat in 2022 to tell her they'd identified Tracy's remains, Pat finally had an answer. But closure? That's harder. Because Tracy's killer has never been identified, DNA from the remains couldn't be matched to anyone in the system. Whoever buried her on that mountain either had no criminal record, or they died before DNA databases became comprehensive, or they're still out there, still walking free. Campbell County locals don't talk about it much. The older residents remember when the skull was found, caused quite a stir back in '85. But then it went cold, and people stopped thinking about baby girl buried up in those woods. Now that she has a name, there's been renewed interest. Someone must remember something. A vehicle seen where it shouldn't be, a local man who disappeared for days with no explanation, a stranger passing through who gave people the creeps. But Appalachia keeps its secrets. The mountains hide what they want to hide. Tracy Sue Walker was 15 years old when someone took her life and dumped her in woods so remote it took 7 years for anyone to find her. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who had dreams and fears and a whole life ahead of her. She deserved better than an unmarked grave on a mountain no one visits. Her case is solved, technically. We know her name now, we know where she's from, we know she's finally going home to Indiana for proper burial next to family who never stopped looking for her. But we don't know who killed her. And somewhere in Campbell County, or Lafayette, or somewhere in between, somewhere a killer once lived, or still lives, or died without ever confessing, there are answers. Maybe buried in an old diary, maybe hidden in someone's memory, maybe written in a letter never sent, locked in an attic trunk, waiting to be found. Someone knows what happened to Tracy Sue Walker. They've known for 47 years. They've kept that secret, carried that weight, looked at themselves in the mirror every morning knowing what they did. Maybe they have children of their own now, grandchildren. Maybe they've lived a normal life, hidden in plain sight, protected by time and silence. And they're still keeping it. It was 11:47 p.m. when Jake noticed the GPS had stopped working. We'd been driving through southern Louisiana for 3 hours, taking what was supposed to be a shortcut back to New Orleans after spending the weekend at my cousin's place in Shreveport. The main highway had been backed up with construction, so Jake, always the one who thought he knew better than technology, decided to take the scenic route through the backroads. "This is fine," he kept saying, even as the paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt. "My dad used to drive through here all the time." But that was 20 years ago. Things change, roads disappear. And some places don't want to be found. The headlights cut through a darkness so complete it felt solid, like we were driving through black velvet. Spanish moss hung from cypress trees like the hair of drowned women, and every now and then I'd catch movement in the periphery, something darting between the trunks, always just out of clear sight. "Jake, I really think we should turn around." "We're almost through. I recognize that barn up ahead." I didn't see any barn, just more darkness, more trees. And then, houses. They materialized out of the night like they'd been photoshopped into reality. Shotgun shacks with peeling paint the color of old bones, windows covered with iron bars, yards choked with weeds that grew waist-high. Every single porch light was off. Not a single vehicle in any driveway. The whole neighborhood looked abandoned, forgotten by time and the living. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was a trick of the headlights, shadows shifting, maybe a deer crossing the road. But shadows don't stand in formation. Shadows don't have eyes that catch light like coins at the bottom of a dark well. "Jake, stop the trucks!" "What? Why?" Then he saw them too. 12 men, standing shoulder to shoulder across the narrow road, forming a human wall. They'd appeared so suddenly, so silently that my brain couldn't process where they'd come from. One second the road was empty, the next they were just there. Jake slammed on the brakes. The truck fishtailed slightly in the loose dirt, and for a terrifying second I thought we were going to plow right into them. We stopped maybe 15 feet away, close enough that our headlights illuminated their faces. They weren't old. They weren't young. They were ageless in that way people get when life grinds them down to pure, hard essence. Worn jeans, flannel shirts or wife-beaters, work boots caked in mud. But it was their faces that made my throat close up. Expressionless. Not angry, not threatening, just blank. Like someone had wiped away every emotion and left only purpose. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a living barricade, staring at us through the windshield with eyes that reflected red in our taillights. "What do we do?" My voice came out as a whisper. "Jake, what do we do?" Jake's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I could hear him breathing, fast and shallow, like he'd just finished a sprint. In the back seat, Marcus had gone completely silent. I'd forgotten he was even there until I heard him whisper a prayer in Spanish. Seconds crawled by. 10, 20, 30. The men didn't blink, didn't shift their weight. It was like looking at a photograph, except photographs don't breathe in sync, don't have chests that rise and fall with unified rhythm. "I'm going through," Jake said finally. "You can't. I'm going through." His voice was steady now, but I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "They'll move. They have to move." He pressed down on the accelerator, slowly at first, then faster. The truck lurched forward, eating up the 15 feet between us and them in seconds. I braced for impact, certain we were about to commit vehicular manslaughter, certain I'd hear the sickening thud of bodies against metal. But they moved. Not panicked, not scrambling, just a smooth, coordinated parting, like a door opening, like they'd practiced this exact movement 1,000 times. 6 men stepped left, 6 stepped right, creating a space just barely wide enough for the truck to pass through. As we drove between them, I made the mistake of looking. They were so close I could have reached out and touched them, close enough to smell sweat and earth and something else, something acrid like burnt hair. Their eyes tracked us as we passed, heads swiveling in perfect unison, 12 pairs of eyes following the truck like we were prey they'd decided to release. But one of them smiled. Just one. The man on the far left, second from the end, his lips curled up at the corners, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. And in that smile was a promise. Not a threat, a promise. "We see you. We know you. And if you ever come back..." We didn't dare look in the rearview mirror until we'd put a mile between us and them. When we finally did, the road behind us was empty, just darkness and trees and that oppressive Louisiana night. None of us spoke for the next hour. When we finally hit the highway, when civilization wrapped around us like a blanket, Marcus said he needed to pee. We pulled into a gas station, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like dying insects. As Jake pumped gas and Marcus disappeared into the bathroom, I sat in the passenger seat, still shaking. My phone had service again. I pulled up Google Maps, zoomed in on where we'd been. There was no road, just green forest, unbroken for miles. I zoomed in further. Nothing. "That's impossible," I whispered. Jake climbed back into the driver's seat, saw what I was looking at. "Maybe the map's out of date." "Google Maps updates satellite imagery every few months. This shows nothing but trees." We stared at the screen together, at the place we'd just driven through, the place that, according to every digital map in existence, didn't exist. Marcus came back with 3 energy drinks and a bag of Takis. "We never talk about this," he said, handing them out. "Whatever the hell that was, we never mention it again. Not to our families, not to each other. It didn't happen." I wanted to argue, wanted to file a police report, wanted to do something. But what would I say? We drove through a neighborhood that doesn't exist and were blocked by men who moved like they shared one brain. So we agreed. We drove the rest of the way in silence, parted ways at my apartment, and I went inside and locked every door and window. That was 3 years ago. I still think about them sometimes, about those 12 men standing in perfect formation, about how they moved as one, about that smile. And I wonder, are they still there, standing guard on a road that doesn't exist, waiting for the next lost travelers who take the wrong turn? Or do they only appear when needed, materializing out of the Louisiana darkness to remind people like us that some shortcuts aren't worth taking? Some places have rules we don't understand. Some communities have secrets they guard with more than just words. And some roads are one way, even when you make it out alive. I've never driven through Louisiana since. and I never will again. Because deep down, I know the truth. We weren't let go. We were let through. There's a difference. And if I ever see those back roads again, I have a sinking feeling they won't open for me a second time. The bloodhounds stopped at the crest and began howling, circles, confusion, as if Polly Melton had simply ceased to exist. September 25, 1981, Deep Creek Trail in the Great Smoky Mountains. 58-year-old Polly was hiking with two friends, Red and Trula, on a trail she'd walked for nearly 20 years. The afternoon was mild, the path crowded with other hikers enjoying the fall colors. Normal, safe, familiar. Except Polly was walking slower than usual that day. Her friends teased her about it. Where was her energy? She'd been acting strange all week, skipping her regular volunteer shift at the hospital without explanation, making mysterious phone calls that Bob, her husband, couldn't quite track. But then, around 4 p.m., something changed. Suddenly, Polly picked up her pace, almost rushed. Her friends called out, "I wouldn't want to be in a foot race with you, Polly." She turned back, laughed, and kept going, fast, determined. They watched her disappear over a small hill on the gravel path. When her friends crested that same hill 30 seconds later, Polly was gone. No sign of her at the bench where hikers usually rested. No glimpse of her tan polyester pants or pink-striped blouse further down the trail. They walked faster, calling her name, assuming she'd headed back to the campground where Bob waited in their Airstream trailer. The trail wasn't long, just a pleasant afternoon walk. There were other hikers everywhere. Someone must have seen her. But when they arrived at the campground at 4:30 p.m., Bob was alone, reading in the trailer. He hadn't seen Polly since she left to hike around 3 p.m. By 6 p.m., park rangers launched a search. By morning, it became one of the largest operations in Smoky Mountains history. Bloodhounds arrived at the spot where Polly had vanished. The dogs sniffed her scent on the trail, followed it to the crest of that small hill, and then began howling in confusion. They couldn't pick up her scent beyond that point. It was as if she'd evaporated into thin air. The search expanded. Hundreds of volunteers, helicopters, thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. No footprints leaving the trail. No torn fabric on branches. No body in the creek below. No disturbance in the undergrowth. Polly was a 2-pack-a-day smoker with high blood pressure and a bad back, not exactly built for cross-country sprinting through the snake-infested woods she famously feared. Here's where it gets stranger. Polly had cigarettes with her, but no money, no identification, no medication she desperately needed for her blood pressure. She wasn't allowed to drive that summer due to health issues, so she had no car keys. She'd left everything valuable back at the trailer. The only thing she wore of any worth was her wedding ring. The day before she vanished, she made a mysterious phone call to someone no one in her family could identify. Her minister later confided to investigators that he suspected an affair, though no proof ever surfaced. Bob had seemed distant lately, worried about Polly's health and behavior. After Polly disappeared, searchers noticed something odd. Bob's prescription bottle of Valium had gone missing from the trailer. The official search ended October 2nd with no trace of Polly Melton. That same night, Bob suffered a devastating stroke. He spent the rest of his life in a nursing home, unable to speak, unable to answer questions about that day. He died never knowing what happened to his wife of 35 years. But the questions remained. So what happened on Deep Creek Trail? Some theorize Polly planned her escape, met a lover at a crossroads, started a new life somewhere far from Jacksonville, Florida. But she left everything behind. Clothes, medicine she desperately needed, her entire identity, her social security benefits. How do you start over at 58 with nothing but the clothes on your back and a pack of cigarettes? And why speed up right before vanishing, as if rushing toward something? Others think abduction. though how someone could snatch a 5'11", 170-pound woman from a crowded trail in broad daylight without witnesses seems impossible. The trail was busy that afternoon. Multiple hikers passed through. No one saw a struggle. No one heard screams. No one noticed a vehicle parked suspiciously nearby. The most disturbing theory? That the mountains themselves took her. Locals who've lived in the Smokies for generations whisper about the silent woods places where the forest goes completely quiet, where people walk in and never walk out. Ancient Cherokee stories speak of portals, thin places where our world touches something else. Some hikers report feeling watched on certain trails, hearing footsteps that match their own pace, seeing shadows that don't belong. Here's what haunts me most about Polly's case. She sped up right before she vanished, like something was pulling her forward, like she saw something over that hill that made her hurry. Maybe someone she recognized, maybe something she'd been looking for all along, maybe something none of us can see or understand. And whatever it was, it took her somewhere none of us can follow. The crack in the sole of her left shoe would have left distinctive footprints, a unique pattern searchers knew to look for. They mapped every inch of that trail for weeks. They never found a single print, not one. It's as if Polly walked to the crest of that hill and simply stepped out of our reality. Her case remains open. Every few years, someone reports seeing an older woman matching Polly's description in some distant town. Nevada, California, Montana. Each lead goes nowhere, because Polly Melton isn't living under a new name in some desert town. She's still in those mountains. The bloodhounds knew it. They howled because they'd reached the edge of something they couldn't cross, a boundary, a threshold, a place where Polly's scent simply ceased to exist in our world. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons in September, hikers on Deep Creek Trail report a strange sensation near that same hill. A sudden chill, the overwhelming urge to walk faster, to hurry forward, to see what's just over the crest. Most resist. They turn back, unsettled, unable to explain the pull they felt. Park rangers don't like talking about it, but there's an unofficial list they keep. People who've reported unusual experiences on that exact section of trail. A woman in 1995 who swore she saw Polly walking ahead of her, pink blouse visible through the trees, always just out of reach. A man in 2003 who heard someone calling his name in a woman's voice, beckoning him off trail. A group of college students in 2017 who all simultaneously felt the urge to run, to sprint over that hill, and had to physically hold each other back from doing it. The Cherokee people who lived in these mountains for thousands of years had stories about places like this. Thin places, they called them, spots where the membrane between worlds grows fragile, where spirits can cross, where the living can slip through if they're not careful. The elders warned their children, if you feel the pull, if something calls your name, if you see someone you recognize but something feels wrong, turn around, walk away, don't look back. But Polly Melton didn't know those stories, or maybe she did and she walked toward it anyway. Maybe whatever was calling her was stronger than fear. Maybe it wore a familiar face. Maybe it promised something she desperately wanted: escape, peace, another chance, a different life. Her daughter still lives in Jacksonville, Florida. She's in her 70s now, never got closure, never understood what happened to her mother that autumn afternoon. Every September 25th, she drives to the Smokies, walks that same trail, stands at the crest of that hill where her mother vanished, and waits, hoping for a sign, hoping for an answer, hoping her mother might somehow walk back over that hill and explain where she's been all these years. But Polly never comes. The hill keeps its secret, and the bloodhounds still won't cross that spot even 43 years later. They circle, whine, pull back on their leashes. They know something humans can't see. They know that some thresholds once crossed don't lead back. The ship had been dying for 3 weeks before they decided to kill the boy. December 1835. The Irish vessel Francis Spaight was crossing the North Atlantic on a route that should have been unremarkable, a voyage made thousands of times on waters charted for centuries. But the North Atlantic in winter answers to no chart and no schedule. The storm that found the spate found it completely, stripping the masts, flooding the lower decks, washing most of the provisions overboard in great dark sheets of water that took whatever was loose and gave nothing back. The ship didn't sink. That would have been in some ways the more merciful outcome. Instead, it became a hulk, mastless, drifting, unsteerable on a grey winter ocean that received their distress signals with total silence. No passing ships, no visible coast, nothing but the slow, wet, exhausting work of staying alive on a vessel that was no longer truly a vessel. Captain Gorman kept order for as long as order was something men were willing to maintain. The first days of survival after a catastrophic storm carry their own dark momentum, bailing, patching, rationing, the grim solidarity of people who have survived something together and are still running on the adrenaline of it. But adrenaline doesn't feed a person. The days passed, the food ran out, and the particular silence that descends on a group of starving men in the middle of the ocean, that silence began. The spate was carrying several cabin boys among its crew, young men, teenage years, placed aboard ships the way young men of limited means were placed in circumstances that treated their lives as casually adjustable. They were the lowest in the hierarchy. They had the least influence, the least experience, the fewest advocates aboard. They were, in the brutal mathematics of a failing ship, the most expendable. By the third week, with no rescue in sight and nothing left to eat, Captain Gorman gathered his crew. What happened next was not spontaneous, not the product of a single moment of terrible impulse. It was a discussion, a decision, made collectively with the grim procedural deliberateness of men who had decided to frame the unframable as an administrative matter. A lottery would be held among the 4 cabin boys. The one who drew the short lot would be sacrificed. The word lottery is doing significant work in that sentence. It implies fairness, it implies chance, the cold neutrality of probability, the removal of personal decision from personal action. If the lots decide, no individual man has to be responsible for the deciding. This is the psychology that has made lotteries of this kind recur across maritime history with disturbing frequency, not because they are moral, but because they provide a structure that makes the immoral feel procedurally defensible. If everyone agrees to the rules become the villain. The boys would have understood what was happening. They were young, but not so young that the meaning was unclear. The men who had been their shipmates, their superiors, the authority figures of their working lives, had decided in open discussion that one of them would not be leaving the ship alive. The lots were drawn. One boy's hand came up with the short straw. He was 17 years old. That detail surfaces in some accounts. 17, signed onto a merchant ship in the way that boys of limited options did, with the vague understanding that the sea was dangerous, but the specific expectation of surviving it. He was shot through the head. The record is plain about this. It was done quickly. Captain Gorman later testified to that. Whether mercy was genuinely the motivation or simply the most palatable framing for official testimony is a question the record cannot answer. The body was divided immediately. The liver, dense with nutrients, the most immediately sustaining organ, was eaten raw by men who had not had food in weeks. The rest was prepared more carefully, some portions cooked, others preserved as best could be managed. It was rationed. It lasted days. And this is where the story shifts into a register harder to process than the violence itself. The men ate, and having eaten, they continued to exist on the ship together. The same men who had discussed the lottery, drawn the lots, carried out what was decided, consumed what resulted. They still had to sleep in the same space, wake in the same gray dawns, look at each other across the wreckage of the deck. The remaining cabin boys were still there, alive, watching, present at every meal in a way that had nothing to do with food. What do you say to each other in that silence? What does the eye contact mean? How does a group of men, having done what they did, continue to function as a group? The question has no clean answer. What the historical record offers instead is outcome. They survived long enough to be rescued. A passing ship spotted the spate and pulled the crew from it. Captain Gorman and his men were brought to Ireland, where they were met with a complicated mixture of horror and sympathy that the courts ultimately resolved by declining to prosecute. Survivors of impossible circumstances, the legal system decided, not murderers. Gorman carried the weight of it publicly for the rest of his life. The story circulated, people had opinions. A poet was so disturbed by the case that he wrote a long narrative work about it, published and widely read. The cabin boy, nameless in most accounts, was made briefly famous by someone else's horror on his behalf. The horror of the Francis Spate is not in its extremity. What makes this story linger is the procedure, the calm, the held vote and the drawn lots and the deliberate conversion of a child's death into a collective decision that no single person had to own. It is the horror of systems, of the way that groups of ordinary people under sufficient pressure can arrive at extraordinary cruelty through the machinery of process and walk away with their sense of themselves as reasonable men largely intact. Captain Gorman was never convicted. He lived the rest of his life in Ireland. He attended church. He grew older. He had, presumably, conversations. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, the waters that once held the drifting Francis Spate continue their ancient motion, indifferent to everything that happened above them. The ocean received what was cast into it and kept it. The question it leaves behind is simple and has no safe answer. If the lots had fallen differently, if your hand had drawn the short straw, what would you want the men around you to have done? And if your hand had drawn long, and you were the one who remained, what would you have done? Sit with that. The Francis Spate itself was eventually rescued and brought to port. The ship was repaired, returned to service, crossed other oceans. It carried other crews who did not know what the planks beneath them had witnessed. Ships are like that. They absorb what happens aboard them and reveal nothing, not to the next captain, not to the next owner, not to anyone. The wood doesn't remember. Or if it does, it keeps the secret with the same absolute indifference as the ocean that holds the dead. But courts do remember. History does. And the boy, 17 years old, name mostly lost, the short straw in his hand, the sea remembered him in the only way the sea ever remembers anyone. It kept him. The tracking dogs picked up Trenny Gibson's scent near Clingman's Dome Tower, followed it for 1.5 miles down the road, then stopped abruptly, confused as if she'd gotten into a vehicle and simply driven away from her own life. October 8, 1976. Trenny Lynn Gibson, 16, joined her Bearden High School class on a field trip to the Great Smoky Mountains. Horticultural students, about 40 of them, hiking to Andrews Bald from Clingman's Dome. The weather was dreary but manageable, cool, overcast but not dangerous. Trenny wore a borrowed brown plaid jacket from her friend, a blue striped sweater, blue jeans, blue Adidas shoes with white stripes, and an expensive ring her father had given her, a diamond and star sapphire ring she never took off. The group was spread out along the trail, some students ahead, some behind, teachers scattered throughout, a constant flow of hikers all around. Not isolated, not alone, not the kind of place where someone should be able to vanish without a trace. That's what makes it so impossible, so wrong, so haunting. Around 3 p.m., during the hike back toward the buses, Trenny's friends stopped to rest on some rocks near the intersection with the Appalachian Trail. They were tired, chatting, taking their time. But Trenny didn't stop. Trenny went on, one classmate later told investigators, seemed to be in a hurry to get back. Another student thought maybe she tried to cut cross-country toward the parking area to save time. The buses were leaving at 3:30 p.m. That was the last time anyone saw Trenny Lynn Gibson. When the buses departed at 3:30 p.m., Trenny wasn't on hers. Teachers did a head count. Panic set in immediately. This wasn't a student running off to smoke or causing trouble. Trenny was responsible, quiet, well-liked. She wouldn't just wander off. Teachers and chaperones searched the immediate area, calling her name, checking restrooms, asking other hikers if they'd seen a teenage girl in a brown jacket. Nothing. Rangers were notified within hours. By the next morning, hundreds of volunteers combed the area with bloodhounds, German shepherds, search and rescue teams from 3 states. The bloodhounds picked up Trenny's scent at the intersection with the Appalachian Trail, right where her friends last saw her. The dogs followed it along the roadside, parallel to Clingman's Dome Road, for over 1 mile. Then the scent just stopped, vanished. like Trenny had gotten into a car or been pulled into one. But there was more. Details that don't fit. Details that investigators quietly noted but couldn't explain. Near where Trenny was last seen, searchers found broken ferns, fresh breaks, as if someone had walked off trail or there'd been a struggle. 3 cigarette butts, not weathered, recently smoked. A partially consumed can of beer still cold to the touch. The next day, they found 8 more cigarette butts of the same brand, Marlboro Reds, at the spot where the dogs lost Trenny's scent. Someone had been waiting there, smoking, drinking, patient. The search continued for weeks. Over 750 people walked every trail, every drainage, every ravine in that area. They used helicopters, infrared technology, cadaver dogs. Park rangers checked every overlook, every parking area, every campground. They found nothing. No clothing, no jewelry, no scrap of the brown jacket or blue jeans, no sign of the distinctive ring. Trenny was 5'3", 115 pounds, small enough to be overpowered. But on a busy trail in the middle of a school group in broad daylight? Her father, Robert Gibson, was devastated. He organized additional searches on his own, spending every weekend in those mountains for months, then years. He walked every trail within 10 miles. He hired private investigators. He never gave up. He died in 2020 without ever knowing what happened to his daughter. Theories multiplied over the years. Some thought Trenny fell into an undiscovered crevice. The Smokies are riddled with caves and sinkholes hidden beneath vegetation. But searchers used ground-penetrating radar and found nothing. Others suspected abduction, though the timeline seemed impossible. Trenny vanished somewhere between 3 p.m. and 3:30 p.m., a window of just 30 minutes. During that window, she should have been visible to other hikers, other students, her teachers. So how did she disappear so completely? Here's another disturbing detail. Trenny's scent dog, yes, she had her own dog with the group, a beagle named Blue, was later found miles away from where Trenny vanished, exhausted and distressed, as if it had been chasing something or someone for hours. The dog had somehow gotten separated from the group and had run in a completely different direction from where the tracking dogs picked up Trenny's scent. What was Blue chasing? What did that dog see or smell that made it run for miles? In 2021, a hiker on the Appalachian Trail reported finding a star sapphire stone near Clingman's Dome. The find made headlines. Could it be from Trenny's ring? The stone was turned over to the FBI for analysis. They determined it wasn't related to Trenny's case. Wrong type of sapphire, wrong setting. But the hope, for a moment, had been real. What haunts investigators is the timeline and the cigarette butts. Someone was near where Trenny vanished, smoking, waiting. Then someone was a mile down the road, smoking again, right where Trenny's scent ended. Someone patient, someone who knew the area, someone who blended in so well that 40 teenagers and multiple teachers never noticed anything wrong, never saw anything suspicious. Trenny would be 64 years old now. For 48 years, her family has waited for answers. For 48 years, those mountains have kept their secret. Her mother, now in her 80s, still hopes for closure before she dies. Still hopes someone will come forward with information, a confession, a location. But secrets have a way of staying buried in the Smokies. The mountains are ancient, patient, indifferent to human suffering. They've swallowed hikers before. Dennis Martin, a 6-year-old who vanished in 1969 and was never found. Thelma Pauline Melton in 1981. Dozens of others over the decades. Some cases eventually solved, most not. Here's what keeps me up at night about Trenny's case. Those cigarette butts, the broken ferns, the beer can, the scent trail that ended at a road. These aren't signs of an accident or a fall. These are signs of something deliberate. Someone waiting. Someone watching teenage girls on a school trip, picking one who walked ahead of her friends, one who was alone for just a moment. And that person took their time. They smoked 11 cigarettes while they waited and watched and planned. They knew the area well enough to know where to park, where to intercept, where to disappear. They knew that the sound of wind through the trees would cover any sounds of struggle. They knew that on a busy October day with hundreds of tourists, one more car on Clingman's Dome Road wouldn't raise suspicion. They were patient. They were prepared. And they got away with it. Somewhere in the Smokies, Trenny Gibson is waiting to be found. And somewhere, maybe in Tennessee, Maybe long dead, maybe still living with the weight of what they did. Someone knows exactly where she is. They've known for 48 years, and they're not telling. The storm didn't kill them. That was the cruelty of it. December 1877. The American schooner Sally M. Steelman was running a familiar route off Cape Hatteras, that jagged finger of North Carolina coast that sailors had long named the graveyard of the Atlantic, not for poetry, but for the body count. Two ocean currents collide there, the cold Labrador current pressing south, the warm Gulf Stream pushing north. Between them, they manufacture weather that is sudden, extreme, and indifferent to whoever happens to be in the middle of it. On this particular December night, the sea decided the Steelman was finished. The storm struck in darkness, which is always worse. No warning silhouette on the horizon, no time to reef sails or batten hatches, or do any of the small, practical things sailors do to remind themselves they have some control. Just a wall of wind and black water that arrived without introduction and did not stop until the ship was unrecognizable. Rigging draped like torn cloth, hull groaning its particular low note, the sound a vessel makes when it is considering surrender. When dawn came, gray, flat, the sun a pale smear behind clouds that offered no warmth, the crew of the Steelman were alive. That was the full extent of their good fortune. The stores of food had been destroyed or swept overboard, the ship was drifting, engines useless, sails gone, no way to steer toward anything. The horizon looked the same in every direction, empty, cold, absolute. And the calendar began its count. You have to understand what hunger actually does to a person, not in the comfortable way we use the word said at noon before lunch, but the real version. By day 3, the stomach stops sending polite signals and begins a kind of internal clawing. By day 7, the body starts consuming itself, converting muscle to energy with a mechanical desperation. And the mind, the intricate, morally structured, carefully socialized human mind, begins to do something that no one discusses at dinner tables. The borders of acceptable thought start quietly moving. Not dramatically, not with alarm bells, just slowly, incrementally, the way a shoreline erodes. Things that lived in the category of impossible begin drifting, gently, toward merely difficult, not as desires, just as options, laid out with a terrible, patient logic. The crew of the Steelman had worked together long enough to know each other, names, habits, the rhythm of a shared watch in the dark hours before dawn. Now they sat in the ruins of their ship and felt that knowing shift into something for which none of them had a name. The familiarity between men who are starving is not warmth, it is something else entirely. What happened in the specific hours leading to the breaking point was never fully reconstructed. Hunger distorts memory as efficiently as it distorts morality. What survived in the historical record, in court papers, in newspaper accounts published across the American coast, was the outcome. Sometime in the third week of drifting, one sailor raised a pistol and shot another man dead. The sound of a gunshot on the open ocean is enormous and then immediately swallowed, a single crack, the echo dissolving over flat gray water, and then a silence that was qualitatively different from any silence before it. A crewman named Barrett did what came next. The record is specific because Barrett himself later described it to reporters who arrived with notebooks and the particular hunger of men paid to find out the worst of things. The body was butchered. Some of it was eaten raw. Fire was unreliable on the damaged ship. Other portions were cooked over whatever flame could be managed. The men ate to survive because eating was the only remaining option, and survival was the oldest and most insistent instruction their bodies knew how to give. When journalists asked Barrett to describe the experience, they expected something: collapse, horror, the visible wreckage of a man who had done something irreversible. What they received instead was the thing that made this story travel across every American newspaper that ran it. Barrett described the taste as comparable to good beefsteak, without distress, without visible remorse. The way you might describe a meal you remembered fondly from a trip somewhere, matter of fact, calm, almost cheerful. That single detail hit the American reading public like a cold wave. Not the violence. The violence could be filed under desperation, under the unknowable pressure of starvation, under circumstances no one at a breakfast table could truly imagine. What could not be so easily filed was the calm, the complete functional absence of horror in a man who had just crossed a threshold that everyone agreed was absolute. Behavioral science offers an explanation that is, in its own way, more disturbing than the act itself. Under sufficient duress, the human brain is capable of partitioning, of sealing the moral weight of an experience behind a door that remains locked for as long as survival requires it. The mechanism is not a malfunction, it is a feature. It exists in all of us, dormant, waiting for conditions most of us will never encounter. Barrett's mind didn't break. It performed exactly as designed. It found a way to continue. The horror isn't in the man, the horror is in the recognition. The survivors were found weeks later by a passing vessel, the steelman still adrift, still wearing the shape of a ship even as it was barely one. The crew were lifted out, gaunt, quiet, carrying in their eyes the particular flatness of people who have been somewhere the rest of the world hasn't. They were brought to shore, they were fed, they gave accounts, they were not prosecuted. Maritime law at the time had no framework for what had occurred, and the courts, perhaps wisely, or perhaps simply gratefully, let ambiguity do what judgment could not. Barrett returned to something like ordinary life. He ate meals, he walked streets. Whether the memory surfaced in the smell of cooking meat, in the specific sensation of deep hunger, in the quiet seconds before sleep, the record doesn't say. He left no further testimony. The steelman was recovered, logged as a navigational hazard, towed to harbor, and dismantled. The ocean accepted the remainder. But the question the ship left drifting behind it has no such clean resolution. On day 1, you are who you believe you are. On day 15, you are whoever hunger decides. Somewhere between those 2 points is a line you were certain, architecturally, fundamentally certain, you would never cross. Barrett found his line. He stepped over it. He described the other side as tasting like beefsteak. And the thing that should sit with you long after this story ends is not the violence, it's the word good. As good as any beefsteak he ever ate. Not just survivable, good. As though the moral weight of what he had done, the thing that would have crushed you or me to contemplate, had simply ceased to exist, reclassified, dissolved by need into something the mind could handle without flinching. The number of days exists in all of us. Most of us will never learn it. We should count that as a mercy. The sea off Cape Hatteras keeps most of its secrets well. It kept most of theirs, but this one escaped, onto the front pages, into the archives, and now into this quiet moment you're sharing with it. The ocean doesn't judge. It never has. It just waits and remembers and keeps its count. The dog was found first. Taj, a golden retriever wandering Shenandoah trails alone, traumatized, refusing to return to where his owners had camped by the peaceful mountain stream, where something unspeakable had happened. May 19, 1996. Julie Williams, 24, and Lollie Winans, 26, set out on what should have been a perfect backpacking trip. They'd met 2 years earlier through Woods Women, a non-profit focused on outdoor education and empowerment for women. They fell in love in the wilderness, bonding over their shared passion for hiking, environmental justice, and the raw beauty of Appalachian trails. Julie was brilliant. Summa cum laude from the University of Minnesota, fluent in Spanish, passionate about geology and social justice. She'd spent time in Guatemala studying volcanoes, teaching English to rural communities. She had plans to return, to make a difference, to live a life that mattered. Lollie was a free spirit from a wealthy Michigan family who'd rejected privilege for wilderness guiding, microbrew drinking adventures in the woods, and a life lived on her own terms. She was funny, irreverent, loyal. She'd worked as a backcountry ranger in the Smokies. She knew how to survive in the wilderness. She knew how to read trails, weather, danger signs. Together, they were planning their future. Jobs lined up in Vermont for the summer, dreams of opening their own outdoor education program, maybe getting married if it ever became legal. They were happy. They were in love. They thought the wilderness was safe. They pitched their tent off the bridle trail in Shenandoah National Park, near a stream in a spot called Skyland. The location was isolated, but not dangerously so, just a quarter mile from Skyline Drive, half a mile from Skyland Lodge, where tourists ate dinner and watched the sunset. Close enough to civilization, remote enough for privacy. The sound of the stream burbling over rocks would have been peaceful, soothing. It would also have masked approaching footsteps. That detail haunts the investigation. They were due back May 28th for their summer jobs. When they didn't return, Julie's father reported them missing May 31st. Rangers found their red Volkswagen Fox in the Skyland parking lot. Then they found Taj wandering the trails, distressed, his leash dragging. Then, on June 1st, they found the women. Julie's body was in a sleeping bag about 40 feet from the tent, partway down an embankment toward the stream, as if she'd been dragged there. Lollie was inside the tent. Both were bound with duct tape, gagged, throats slit with something sharp, a knife, investigators believed, though the weapon was never recovered. Partially undressed but not sexually assaulted, at least no semen was found, though the positioning of their bodies and clothing suggested sexual motivation. Here's what made it even more horrifying. The duct tape over Julie's mouth had been removed and used to bind Lollie, suggesting the killer spent time at the scene, suggesting control, deliberation, suggesting this wasn't a frenzied attack but something methodical, something the killer took his time with, maybe hours. The killer had used their own duct tape, brought with him or found in their gear, to bind them. He'd used their tent as his crime scene. He'd left them there for the stream to sing over, for Taj to find, for the wilderness they loved to witness. For 28 years, the case haunted investigators and terrified the hiking community. In 2002, they indicted Darrell David Rice, who'd been convicted of attempted abduction of a woman in the park in 1997. He'd grabbed a female cyclist, tried to force her into the woods, but she fought back and escaped. Attorney General John Ashcroft announced the charges as a hate crime. Julie and Lollie were openly lesbian, and prosecutors claimed Rice had stated women like them deserved to die for their sexuality. The LGBT community rallied. This was bigger than two murders. It was an attack on their right to exist, to love, to be safe in public spaces. The trial was supposed to bring justice, closure, answers. But in 2004, DNA evidence exonerated Rice. The charges were dropped. 15 days later, Rice died in a car accident, a coincidence that fed conspiracy theories for years. His name was forever tainted by a crime he didn't commit. For 20 more years, the case went cold. Julie and Lollie's families grieved without answers. The camping spot was closed, became a memorial, a warning. Hikers avoided it, claimed it felt wrong, heavy, haunted. Then, in June 2024, advanced DNA testing finally identified the killer. Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a convicted serial rapist from Cleveland, Ohio. He was a residential painter and an avid hiker, known to frequent Shenandoah National Park. He had a history of violence against women, kidnapping, rape, assault. He knew the park intimately, had hiked its trails for years. He died in prison in 2018, serving time for other crimes, having never been connected to the murders. The FBI announced the breakthrough with relief. Case closed. Families could finally grieve properly. But here's what the FBI won't say publicly, what investigators whisper off the record. What else did Leo Jackson do? He was known to alter license plates frequently, use temporary tags, swap vehicles. He had a documented history of traveling along the East Coast, staying in cheap motels, moving constantly. He'd been arrested multiple times in different states for assault, kidnapping attempts, rape. He knew how to hunt women in isolated areas. He'd done it before, he'd do it again. And he frequented national parks. Specifically, he frequented Shenandoah. So here's the horrifying question. How many other women did Leo Jackson kill in those woods? How many other campsites became crime scenes? How many other hikers met him on a trail, thought he seemed friendly, maybe shared a campfire, and never made it home? The investigation is ongoing. They're looking at Jackson's movements through the years, cross-referencing unsolved cases, checking missing persons reports from the 1980s and 1990s, examining cold cases from Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. They're excavating his past, his patterns, his hunting grounds. But Julie and Lollie didn't know any of that on May 19th when they set up their tent by that beautiful stream. They didn't know that someone was watching, someone who'd done this before, someone who selected his victims carefully, isolated campsites, women alone or in pairs, locations where the sound of water would cover screams. Their last photograph shows them happy, hiking, alive, in love. Julie's arm around Lollie's shoulders, Taj panting in the frame, sunlight filtering through the trees. The camera stopped clicking after that. Taj knew what happened. He saw everything. His owners bound, terrorized, murdered while he was helpless, maybe tied to a tree, maybe locked in the car. He carried that trauma for the rest of his life. He's gone now too, taking whatever he witnessed to the grave. The stream still flows in Shenandoah. The trails are still beautiful. Rangers will tell you the park is safe, and statistically it is. Millions visit without incident. But some campsites remember what happened there. The earth remembers blood. The trees remember screams. And somewhere in evidence storage, Julie and Lollie's case files sit alongside others. Unsolved disappearances, unexplained deaths, women who went camping and never came home. Leo Jackson's hunting ground was bigger than 2 victims. The investigation continues, and the trees keep their secrets until DNA makes them talk. He was the only one still walking by the time he understood what was happening. April 3, 1890. The German schooner Johanna left Port Louis, Mauritius, bound for Melbourne, a long haul across the southern Indian Ocean, some of the most remote and volatile water on the planet. The Southern Ocean doesn't accommodate ships the way the Caribbean or the Mediterranean do. It tolerates them temporarily and then decides otherwise. The Johanna had made crossings before. The crew had experience. The cargo was routine. What came aboard in Mauritius, invisible, was not. Tropical disease exists in the spaces between things, between bodies in close quarters, between hands that touch the same ropes, between breath that circulates in a poorly ventilated forecastle where men sleep packed in the way that the maritime economy demanded. Whatever had taken hold, in Mauritius, or in the particular stress of a ship moving from tropical warmth into the cold systems of the Southern Ocean, it spread quietly at first, the way these things always do, through the ship's population before anyone fully grasped what was moving through them. The first man went down with fever. High, persistent, the kind that soaks through clothing and leaves a person glassy-eyed and beyond the reach of conversation. He was moved to the forecastle and attended to. The second man followed within days. Then the third. The mate, Mr. Hagen, watched it happen in the particular sequence that someone at the unaffected margin watches a catastrophe unfold. First concern, then alarm, then the sickening recognition that the scope of what he was seeing was larger than his ability to intervene. He was healthy. He remained healthy. The disease moved around him like water around a stone, taking everyone else and leaving him standing. The men in the forecastle screamed for water. This detail appears consistently in accounts, not whispered requests, not quiet suffering, but screaming. The particular delirium of high fever in a cramped wooden space with inadequate ventilation produces a suffering that is total and loud. Hagen brought water. He moved between the men. He did what one person can do for many people when many people are dying, and one person is all there is. One by one, they stopped screaming. One by one, they stopped. Hagen was alone on a ship in the southern Indian Ocean, the only man aboard who could still move, still navigate, still perform the basic operations that kept a vessel from being entirely at the mercy of whatever the sea decided next. He was also alone with the bodies, and the bodies had to go overboard. This was not cruelty, it was the medical reality of an enclosed space with a live contagion still present. Whatever had killed the crew was still there, on the surfaces they'd touched, in the air of the spaces they'd occupied. Hagen burned what bedding could be burned, he disposed of what had to be disposed of, he threw the bodies of men he had worked alongside, young men, some barely out of their teens, full of the specific noise and energy of people who haven't yet learned that the world can simply end them, into the Southern Ocean, one by one, in whatever weather the Southern Ocean produced that day. The ocean received them without ceremony. It always does. What happened in Hagen's mind during those hours and days is not something the historical record has preserved in detail. He later gave accounts to maritime authorities in Melbourne when he somehow managed to bring the Johanna into port alone. itself a nautical achievement that deserves acknowledgement, a man single-handing a merchant vessel across some of the world's most demanding water. He answered the questions put to him. He was, by all accounts, functional. But there are things that happen to a person in that kind of solitude that do not appear in official accounts. There is the specific quality of silence on a ship designed for 20 men and currently holding 1. The sounds a vessel makes in heavy swells, the creaking, the shifting, the low groans of a hull moving through water are sounds that become human-shaped in the dark when you are the only living person for hundreds of miles in any direction. There are the spaces that used to be occupied and now aren't. The hammock that hangs still, the mug left where a man set it down before he went to the forecastle and didn't come back out. Hagen maintained course. He managed sails in conditions that would challenge a full crew. He arrived in Melbourne, tied up the Johanna at her berth, and reported what had happened to the people who needed to know. He was written about briefly. His name appears in maritime records and in newspaper accounts in Melbourne and in Germany, where the ship was registered. And then the record goes quiet, as it always does with the people history picks up and puts back down. But the image persists. 1 man, a ship built for 20. The Southern Ocean in April, when the weather is moving toward the brutal winter systems that make that stretch of water among the most consistently dangerous on the planet. The forecastle empty. The silence of a space where men had been screaming 4 days ago, a screaming so loud, so insistent, so full of the animal need for water and presence and for someone to acknowledge that they were dying, and now nothing. Just the ship, just Hagen, just the ocean. The fear of contagion is ancient, older than germ theory, older than medicine's ability to explain what we're actually afraid of. We recognize it before we understand it. The sealed space, the invisible thing moving through it, the question of which bodies will cross which threshold. The terrible patience of something that spreads on hands, on breath, on the surfaces of everything, and chooses its victims with no apparent logic and no discernible mercy. There is a detail that Hagen reportedly never shook, according to those who knew him afterward. Not the deaths themselves, not the solitude of sailing the Johanna alone across that vast and hostile ocean. It was the screaming. The specific quality of it, men reduced by fever to that register, half coherent, half lost, calling for water and for people and for things that weren't there and never would be again. He heard it for days. He moved through it, back and forth, doing what 1 man can do. And then it stopped. All at once, the way things stop on ships when there is no one left to make noise. He said the silence after was the loudest thing he had ever heard. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs only to people who have been the last one left, the last survivor in a space designed for many, surrounded by evidence of the people who were there before. Not the loneliness of solitude, which is a condition a person can adjust to, can even find peace in. This is something different. This is the loneliness of aftermath, of standing in the negative space that other people's lives left behind. Hagen carried the Johanna to Melbourne through that negative space. He docked it. He filed his reports in the clipped professional language that maritime culture demands, a language deliberately designed to keep feeling at a distance from function. The authorities inspected the ship. They confirmed his account. They cleared him of any wrongdoing. He was a man who had survived, who had done his duty, who had brought the ship in. He went home eventually, or to whatever the equivalent of home was for a man who had experienced what he had experienced and was now expected to resume the shape of an ordinary life. He ate meals. He slept. He presumably answered when people asked how his voyage had gone. The southern Indian Ocean continued south of all of it, cold and immense and completely unbothered. The bodies Hagen had given to it are still there, somewhere, in water so deep and so remote that they will remain there effectively forever. The ocean doesn't mark the spot. It doesn't leave any indication that these particular men passed through this particular water and stayed. It just continues, cold and vast and silent, the way it was before the Johanna arrived and the way it will be long after every person who knew this story is gone. The silence Hagen described was the loudest thing he ever heard. Some silences are like that. We crossed the state line at dusk. Connor was driving. It was his truck, his idea for this whole let's explore rural America road trip we'd been on for 3 days. I was navigating, which mostly meant watching the GPS die as we got deeper into areas where cell towers didn't exist. "Turn right in half a mile," I said, reading the last update before the signal dropped completely. Connor turned. The paved road became gravel, then dirt, then just 2 tire ruts cutting through dense forest. Trees pressed in on both sides, branches scraping the truck's sides like skeletal fingers testing for weakness. "This is definitely the road to the campground," Connor asked. I checked my phone. No service. The map showed a blue dot in the middle of green nothing. According to what I downloaded earlier, yeah, should be another 5 miles. We drove and drove. The road got narrower, darker. The sun was setting fast now, that twilight hour where everything gets sharp and strange. I started seeing shapes in the trees that looked like people, like animals, like nothing at all. Then Connor slowed down. "Do you see that?" I looked ahead, squinting into the gloom. Something was hanging from a tree branch about 20 feet up. Something metallic, catching the last of the light. "Probably just trash," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. We kept driving. Another tree, another hanging object. This time I could make it out clearly, a machete suspended from a rope, swaying slightly despite no wind. "Okay, that's weird," Connor muttered. Weird became horrifying in the next 100 yards. The trees were full of them, dozens, hundreds, knives of every size and description hanging from branches like a cutlery mobile. Machetes and kitchen knives and hunting blades and things I didn't have names for, all suspended at different heights, all turning slowly in place. And between them, other things. Doll parts, arms and legs and heads with their eyes gouged out, hanging from fishing line. They spun faster than the knives, their plastic smiles catching the dying light. Some were old, the kind of porcelain dolls your grandmother kept. Others were modern, Barbie and Ken stripped naked and dismembered. "Turn around," I said. "Turn around right now." But the road was too narrow. Connor tried to 3-point turn, but between the trees and the steep ditches on either side, there wasn't enough room. We'd have to keep going forward until we found a wider spot. So we drove deeper into the grove. The hanging objects got more numerous, more varied. Rusted chains joined the collection, their links welded together in patterns that might have been decorative or might have been something else. Scraps of fabric, clothes, flags, I couldn't tell, fluttered between the metal and plastic. And scattered throughout, objects I couldn't identify. Things wrapped in plastic, things that looked organic, things that might have been animal skulls or might have been something worse. The worst part wasn't what we could see, it was the sound. Every hanging object made noise. The knives clinked against each other like wind chimes, the dolls clacked as they spun, the chains rattled. Together they created a symphony of metallic and plastic notes that sounded almost like voices, almost like whispers. "This is someone's property," Connor said, his voice tight. "Someone did this deliberately." "Keep driving. What if they're still here?" "Connor, keep driving." The road curved, and the hanging things grew denser. Some branches were so loaded down they sagged under the weight. We had to duck our heads as we passed under one particularly low-hanging machete, its blade close enough to the windshield that I could see rust patterns that looked deliberately painted. Then I saw the first doll head with the fresh flowers in its eye sockets. "Someone's been here recently," I whispered. Connor didn't respond. He was focused on the road, which had become almost impossible to see in the gathering dark. Our headlights created weird shadows, making the hanging objects look like they were moving independently, reaching for us. That's when we both felt it. The sensation of being watched. Not a vague unease, not imagination, a specific, targeted feeling that someone or something was observing us from the trees, tracking our progress through their bizarre garden of horrors. I turned on the truck's high beams and immediately wished I hadn't. Deeper in the woods, just visible between the trunks, were more hanging things. But these weren't on branches, they were on posts, tall wooden posts driven into the ground, and from them hung objects so large, so complex, that I couldn't process what I was seeing. Frameworks made of welded metal, shapes that might have been cages, structures that looked almost like... "Are those gallows?" Connor breathed. I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because movement caught my eye, a shadow shifting between the posts, too large to be a deer, too oddly shaped to be human. "Drive!" I screamed. Connor punched the gas. The truck fishtailed in the loose dirt, but he straightened it out, pushing 40, then 50, then 60 on a road that was barely a road. Branches screamed against the sides, hanging objects blurred past, a stream of metal and plastic and horror. We drove for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes. Finally, blessedly, the trees thinned, the hanging objects became sparse, then disappeared. We burst out of the woods onto a proper gravel road, and Connor didn't slow down until we hit pavement. We pulled into the first gas station we saw. 24-hour fluorescent lights, 2 other cars at the pumps, a clerk visible through the window reading a magazine. Normal, safe, real. We sat in the truck, engines running, hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" Connor finally asked. I pulled out my phone. Service had returned. I tried to mark the location, to screenshot it, to save evidence. But according to GPS, we'd never left the main road. Our route showed a straight line from the state border to this gas station. No detour, no forest road, no grove of hanging horrors. "Check your odometer," I said. Connor looked. His face went pale. We should have used 30 miles of gas, maybe more with all that rough driving. And we used 4 miles. 4 miles, but we'd driven for at least 20. At least. We called the police anyway, told them about the grove, the hanging objects, the sense of danger. The dispatcher was sympathetic but skeptical. She asked for a location. We had nothing to give her. The next day, in full sunlight and surrounded by other people, we tried to find the road again. Drove up and down the state line for 3 hours, never found it. That was 6 months ago. Connor sold his truck last month. Said he couldn't drive it anymore without thinking about those hanging things, without hearing that metallic symphony in his head. I understand, because I hear it too, sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep. The clinking of blades, the clacking of doll parts, the rattle of chains. And I wonder, was it a warning, a territory marker, some kind of ritual ground maintained by people who live so far from civilization that they've invented their own rules, their own rituals, their own gods? Or was it bait? We drove away. But what about the people who stopped? What about the curious ones who got out of their vehicles to investigate, to photograph, to touch? What happened to them? I don't know. And the truth is, I don't want to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some roads better left unexplored. And some groves are hanging gardens of human madness, and the only smart thing to do is drive past as fast as you can and pray they don't decide to add you to their collection. They left before dawn, because people who cross illegally always leave before dawn. 2008. 33 people from the Dominican Republic climbed into a small boat on the dark side of the island and pointed themselves toward Puerto Rico, 23 miles across the Mona Passage. 23 miles. In good conditions, with a functional boat and a reliable skipper, it is a crossing of a few hours. You leave in the dark. You arrive in the light. You begin the new chapter of the life you crossed a body of water to reach. The boat had no GPS. The skipper, who had made similar crossings before and carried the quiet confidence of someone who has gotten away with something enough times to mistake luck for skill, lost his bearing in the dark. By the time the sun came up, the Dominican coast was gone, and Puerto Rico had not appeared to replace it. The Mona Passage, which sits between the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean and behaves according to the moods of both, was not the calm crossing it had been described as. The fuel ran out. This is the detail that ends everything. Not the lost bearing, which might have been corrected, not the weather, which was manageable. The fuel ran out on a boat with no sail, no radio, no GPS, and 33 people aboard. And then there was nothing to do but drift. The Mona Passage is not the middle of the ocean. It is a stretch of water with coastlines on either side, with shipping lanes, with the occasional fishing or Coast Guard vessel. But being near land and being visible to anyone on that land are different things entirely. A small boat low in the water, without radio, without flares, without any of the equipment that makes a vessel findable, it can drift in trafficked water for days without anyone seeing it, especially a boat that chose not to be seen. The sun in the Mona Passage is direct and relentless. There was no shelter aboard, no fresh water stored beyond what had been packed for a 3-hour crossing. The plan had not included a 15th day on open water. The plan had been simple, reasonable. 23 miles, a new life. The plan had not survived contact with the dark. On day 1, people managed. On day 3, the water was gone. Thirst in direct tropical sun is not a slow suffering, it accelerates, compounding against the heat and the salt spray and the physical exposure, and it produces in people a deterioration that moves faster than the mind expects. By day 5, the group of 33 had become something different from the group that had climbed into the boat in darkness. The shared aspiration, the dream of Puerto Rico, of a life somewhere with more margin in it, had been replaced by the specific and total focus of people dying by degrees. They began to die, quietly, then in groups. The bodies went overboard because a dead body in a small boat in tropical heat creates conditions that accelerate the deaths of everyone else still aboard. 1, then 2, then more. The wailing that accompanied each loss was heard by no one. The Mona Passage received it without response, as it receives everything. On day 14, the 28th person died. There were now 5 people alive on that boat, 5 people who had been without food for nearly 2 weeks and without fresh water for most of that time. 5 people whose bodies had been reduced to the final register of need, stripped of everything that was not survival. A man named Gregorio Maria Marizan was one of them. He survived. He talked to journalists afterward because the story came out, and once it came out, the talking became part of the survival, a way of continuing to exist in a world that now knew what he had done and was going to have opinions about it regardless. He described what happened on day 14 with the particular flatness of someone who has already processed the fact that the world's judgment is a thing they will carry and have decided to carry it anyway. They ate from the body, strips of flesh from the leg and chest. Marizan described the taste as fibrous, like beef, with yellow fat. He said it the way Barrett had said it on the Steelman more than a century earlier, with a matter-of-factness that is, in some ways, more disturbing than horror would be. Not because he was unaffected, but because by day 14 on the Mona Passage, the vocabulary of affect had been compressed to its absolute minimum. What remained was just the report. This is what we did, this is what it was, this is how we are still alive to tell you. The 5 survivors were rescued on day 15 by a vessel that spotted them, by chance, by the particular luck that survival sometimes generates after refusing to for 2 weeks. They were brought to Puerto Rico, they were given medical care, and then, in the detail that should be allowed to sit in silence for a moment before moving past it, they were arrested. All 5, charged in connection with what had happened on day 14. They served approximately a year in jail before being released. They had crossed the Mona Passage to find a better life. They arrived in handcuffs. 27 people did not arrive at all. 27 people went overboard, one by one, across 15 days, into water that is technically classified as a maritime transit zone and is functionally the most anonymous place in the world for the people who cross it without papers, because the anonymity is the point. No documents, no record, no trail. If you die there, the ocean is your answer. Marizan came home eventually, to the Dominican Republic, to the same side of the island he had left in darkness, hoping never to return to. He had crossed the Mona Passage and come back to where he started, changed in a way that has no name that fits comfortably into any language. This story happened in 2008, in a world with satellites and Coast Guard infrastructure and cell phones. Not in 1835, not in 1877, now, or close enough to now that the world those 33 people left behind is recognizable as the one we occupy. They were ordinary people with a dream and a boat and a skipper who had done it before, and a night that looked safe enough to try. 28 of them found out what the ocean keeps. 5 of them came back to explain it. Marizan said it tasted fibrous, like beef with yellow fat. He said it the way you report a fact that belongs to a place your mind has filed carefully away, behind a door that stays closed most of the time, but not all of the time, and especially not in the dark, and especially not near water. The Mona Passage still carries people across it before dawn, smaller boats than they should be using, with less water than they need, and skippers who have done it before and would like to do it again. The ocean doesn't check credentials. It doesn't distinguish between the crossing that works and the one that doesn't until the fuel runs out and the bearing is lost and the sun comes up over water that looks the same in every direction. And then the count begins. 1, 2, 3. By the time the 15 days are done, you will know exactly what you are capable of. You will know what it tastes like. and you will carry that knowledge back across whatever ocean you manage to survive into whatever life is still waiting for you on the other side. The sea doesn't judge, it only counts. The fight started somewhere in Missouri. One of those stupid married couple arguments that snowballs from nothing. I said something about stopping for gas. Kelly said we had enough to make it to the next town. I insisted. She got defensive. And before you know it, we weren't talking about gas anymore. We were talking about every grievance we'd been hoarding for 6 months. The real problem wasn't gas. It was the job offer in Seattle. The one I'd turned down without consulting her. The one that would have doubled my salary but meant leaving her family, her friends, her whole support system. We'd been over it 100 times, but apparently we weren't done yet. By the time we crossed into Kansas, we were on hour 3 of furious silence. I saw the exit purely out of spite. Topeka, 15 miles, the sign said, with a smaller sign underneath indicating a state route that cut south. I didn't consult Kelly, didn't discuss, just took the exit, because I wanted to be right about something, even if that something was just choosing our route. The highway gave way to a 2-lane road, then to something barely paved. Houses started appearing, small, weathered, the kind of rural poverty that makes you uncomfortable because there's nothing you can do about it. Yards full of broken appliances, dogs on chains that barked as we passed. We drove through a crossroads that might have been a town once, but was now just 4 buildings huddled together like they were afraid of the empty fields around them. "This isn't Topeka," Kelly said, her first words in an hour. "I know." "Then where?" "I don't know, Kelly. I'm figuring it out." We should have turned around, should have swallowed our pride, admitted the mistake, found our way back to the highway. But pride is a hell of a drug, and I was already 3 exits deep into my stupid decision. So I kept driving, telling myself the next intersection would have a sign, would point us back to civilization. Instead, we found the town. If you could call it that. A dozen houses arranged in a perfect grid, like someone had laid them out with a ruler and a textbook on urban planning. Most were single-story, with aluminum siding that had aged to the color of old teeth. A few had yards with rusted swing sets that hadn't moved in years, weeds growing up through the seats. One had a barn that had burned down, recently based on the char marks still black against the wood, the smell of smoke still faint in the air. And every single house felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on why at first. They looked normal enough. Mailboxes at the curbs, street numbers painted on the foundations, the kind of place that should have been forgettable, just another dying rural hamlet bleeding population to cities and suburbs. But there was something in the air, a thickness, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. I slowed down without thinking about it, cruising at maybe 15 miles per hour down what passed for the main street. My hands were tight on the wheel, white-knuckled even though nothing had happened yet. In the passenger seat, Kelly had stopped looking at her phone and was staring at the houses. "There's no one here," she whispered. She was right. No cars in driveways, no lights in windows even though it was past 6 and the sun was starting to set. No smoke from chimneys despite it being late October and cold enough that I could see our breath when we'd gotten gas an hour ago. No movement anywhere. Just stillness. Complete and total stillness. "Ghost town," I said, trying to sound casual. "We'll go through and circle back to..." That's when the first door slammed. We both jumped. I actually hit the brake, the car jerking to a stop hard enough that Kelly's seatbelt locked. The sound had come from our left, a house with faded yellow siding and a front porch that sagged like a broken back. The door was closed now, but had it been open before? I couldn't remember. I hadn't been paying attention. Then another door slammed, house 2 down from the first. Then another. Then another. 5 houses in quick succession, bang, 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 like dominoes falling. Each one closing, shutting, locking out or locking in, I couldn't tell which. The sounds echoed through the empty street, bouncing off the houses, multiplying until it sounded like a dozen doors, 2 dozen, all slamming in unison. "Drive," Kelly said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "Drive. Now." I didn't argue. I hit the gas, probably harder than I should have. We lurched forward, tires squealing slightly on the cracked pavement. The car felt sluggish, like we were driving through water instead of air. But as we passed each house, I made the mistake of looking. The curtains were moving. Not from wind. All the windows were closed, I could see that clearly. But behind them, shadows shifted. And faces. Pale, indistinct at first, but definitely faces pressed against the glass, watching us drive past. "Don't look," Kelly hissed. But she was looking too. We both were. We couldn't help it. Because the faces weren't just watching. They were afraid. At the third house, I saw an old man, his face so close to the glass his breath would have fogged it if he was real. His eyes were wide, white showing all around. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Warning us? Calling for help? At the fourth house, a young woman in what looked like a nightgown from the 1950s. Her hands were pressed flat against the window, fingers splayed, and there was something dark on her palms. Dirt. Or blood. At the fifth house, children. 3 of them, different heights, pressed together like they were huddling for warmth. The smallest one was crying. I could see tears on their cheeks even from the car. "Don't look," Kelly said again, and this time her voice broke. But I couldn't stop looking. Because at the last house before the road curved back toward the fields, I saw them clearly. The family I'd glimpsed earlier, a woman and 2 children, standing at the window, not moving, not waving, just watching. Their eyes were wide, too wide, like someone had held their eyelids open and forced them to stare. Their mouths were open like they were screaming, except no sound came out, not even when I could see their throats working, see the tendons in their necks standing out with the effort. And their hands, all 6 hands flat against the window, fingers splayed, but now I could see what the woman had on her palms. Words, written in something dark, backwards so we could read them from outside. Then we were past the houses, back into open fields, and I floored it. The car shuddered with the speed, straining against whatever invisible force had been holding it back. But I didn't care. I kept my foot down until we hit a 4-way stop 10 miles later, until I saw a gas station that actually had cars at the pumps, other people, real people pumping gas and checking their phones and doing normal things, until reality wrapped back around us like a security blanket. We pulled in, parked, sat there with the engine running. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Kelly's hand found mine. Not romantic, just desperate. 2 people who'd just seen something they couldn't explain, needing to confirm the other person was still there, still real. "What the hell was that?" Her voice shook. "I don't know. Those people, they were trying to warn us. Did you see what she wrote? On her hands?" "I saw." "So what were they warning us about? The town, or something in the town?" I had no answer. Still don't. We called the police from that gas station, told them we'd seen something weird, people who looked like they needed help in a town south of Topeka. The dispatcher was kind but confused. She asked for specifics, a town name, a road number, a landmark, anything to help her send someone. We had nothing. Just south of Topeka, off exit 47, maybe 10 miles down a state routes. When she checked, there was no exit 47. The next exit after where we'd gotten on was 52, and it was 20 miles north, not south. When we pulled up GPS on Kelly's phone, it showed us on Route 75, which didn't have any exits for 30 miles in either direction. Maybe we were confused, I said, but even I didn't believe it. Maybe it was 57 or... We weren't confused. Kelly grabbed my phone, started scrolling through maps, zooming in and out, trying to find any evidence of where we'd been. It was here. Right here. I know it was. But there was nothing. Just fields and farmland, uninterrupted for miles. No roads, no towns, no grid of houses with terrified people at the windows. We drove home in silence. A different kind than before. Not angry. Afraid. The kind of afraid where you keep checking your mirrors, where every car that follows you for more than a mile makes your heart race, where you're grateful for streetlights and traffic and all the mundane normalcy of civilization. That night, I dreamed of those faces. The way they pressed against the glass, the way their mouths formed words I couldn't hear. And in the dream, I understood what they were saying. Get out. Get out while you can. It's coming. It's always coming. But what was coming? And were they trapped there, forced to watch it arrive again and again? Or were we the ones who'd almost been trapped, saved only by the grace of not stopping, not getting out of the car? When I woke up, Kelly was already awake, sitting by the window, staring out at our normal suburban street. "I keep thinking about them," she said without looking at me. "What if they're still there? What if they're always there, waiting for someone to stop, to help? We can't go back. I know." She turned to me finally, and her eyes were red. "But what if that's what they want? What if the whole thing is a trap, and they're the bait?" I had no answer. Still don't. 4 years later, Kelly and I are divorced. Not because of the town. We never fought about that, never disagreed on what we saw. No, we split because once you've seen something that impossible together, once you've witnessed the fundamental wrongness of reality, every normal problem seems both trivial and insurmountable. How do you fight about whose turn it is to do dishes when you've both seen people trapped behind glass, mouths forming warnings you can't hear? How do you worry about money, or careers, or where to spend Christmas when you know there are places that exist and don't exist, that catch travelers and keep them as window decorations? I avoid Kansas now, avoid backroads in general, prefer interstates where everything is mapped and monitored and makes sense. I avoid any small town that feels too quiet, too perfect, too arranged, because I learned something that day that I can't unlearn. Some places aren't on maps because they don't want to be found. Some communities aren't hiding from the world, they're hiding from something else, something that comes for them again and again, something that makes them stand at windows and watch and warn. And whatever they're watching for, whatever made them write "run" on their palms in something dark, I pray I never find out what it is. I pray it stays in that impossible town, in those watching windows, in that place that shouldn't exist. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's already found me. By the time they cast lots for who would die next, there were only 4 of them left. August 1899, the Norwegian bark Drott was working a cargo route through the Florida Straits. Warm water, blue sky, the kind of summer crossing that makes a sailor forget the sea can be anything other than beautiful. Then the hurricane arrived. It came from the south, the way the worst Caribbean storms do, building over open ocean until it is not a weather system anymore, but something closer to an intention. When it reached the Drott, it killed the ship almost immediately, not slowly, fast and total. The hull breaking open, the crew thrown into dark, churning water, the ship disappearing below the surface with a finality that left no room for negotiation. 6 men survived the sinking. They pulled themselves onto a raft, less a vessel than a floating platform, something designed for the 30 minutes between a ship going down and a rescue arriving, not for the open ocean, not for days in August sun. The raft had no food, no fresh water. In the Florida Straits, in summer, the sun arrives like something punitive. The sea all around is salt water that kills you more efficiently the more of it you drink. The first day, they bailed water and watched the horizon for ships. The horizon returned nothing. Dehydration is a different kind of suffering than starvation. It operates faster and with less mercy. The throat seizes first, then the eyes dry and blur, then the mind begins to fragment in ways that are distinctive and disturbing to witness from outside. A man dying of thirst in extreme heat passes through coherence into a place where the ordinary rules of perception no longer apply. Things happen in the mind that the body then acts on as though real. One of the 6 men reached that threshold on the 3rd day. He began speaking in ways that didn't track. His eyes moved to things that weren't there. And then, before anyone could stop him, he was in the water, having gone over the side in some private delirium the survivors could not reconstruct, into the Florida Straits, and gone. 5 men remained. On the 4th day, one of the 5 died of exposure and thirst, a quieter death, the body simply stopping the way bodies do when they have been pushed past their final threshold. He was dead. He was there, on the raft, with 4 men who had not had water in 4 days, and who were dying in the Florida sun with no help coming from any direction they could see. What happened next was not discussed, according to survivor accounts. It was not agreed upon through the machinery of lots or a vote or any of the formal structures that other maritime disasters had used to give themselves procedural cover. It simply happened, the way desperate things happen when the mind has been reduced to its oldest and most insistent layer. The blood was warm, it was liquid. 4 men who were dying of thirst were surrounded by something that could, by the logic of bodies reduced to pure function, delay that dying. They drank, and having crossed that line, the line moved. The next day, the largest man on the raft, a German, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that earns mention in historical accounts that bother with physical detail, drew the short lot. The survivors had now, deliberately and with the remnant of conscious decision-making available to men in that state, formalized what the day before had been an act of desperate impulse. They had held a lottery. They were, in their own stripped-down way, being procedurally fair. He was stabbed through the heart. Quickly, that word keeps appearing in these maritime horrors, always quickly, as though speed transforms the nature of what is being done. The blood was taken immediately. Strips of flesh were cut and eaten raw on the raft in the August sun, in the warm and beautiful water of the Florida Straits, with the horizon still empty in every direction. 2 men survived. A British steamship found them, 2 figures on a raft in the middle of the Straits, in a state the ship's crew reportedly struggled to describe afterward. The survivors were taken aboard, given water, brought to port. They told their story because they had no compelling reason not to, or perhaps because they had lost the capacity in those days on the raft to fully reconstruct what shame was supposed to feel like in relation to what had happened. The accounts are detailed, clinical in the way that the accounts of people who have survived things that shouldn't be survivable often become clinical, stripped of the emotional scaffolding, reduced to sequence and fact. What the story of the drought offers that other maritime disasters don't is the visible progression. The documented movement from witnessing a death to drinking blood from the newly dead to formally casting lots for the next death, all within the span of a few days on a raft in open water. You can track the erosion in real time. You can watch, in the sequence of events, the specific stages at which each threshold was crossed. This is what makes it instructive in a way that is deeply uncomfortable. Most stories of human extremity present the darkness as sudden, a moment, a single terrible crossing. The drought presents it as a gradient, a series of small, almost logical steps, each one enabled by the last, each one moving the men a little further from the people they had been when the ship went down. There is no villain. There is no moment where a bad person makes a bad decision. There are just people, in impossible circumstances, moving along a gradient that the circumstances created and that the human animal navigated the only way it knew how. The 2 survivors went home. Whether they spoke of those days on the raft, at dinner tables, with family, in the quiet before sleep, is not recorded. People who have been to certain places tend to keep those places quiet. The Florida Straits are warm and blue and crossed by thousands of ships every year. The water there is beautiful in August, particularly at sunset, when the light comes low across the surface and turns it the color of something worth writing a poem about. The drought is at the bottom of it. 6 men went into the water when she sank, 2 came back out. The raft is long gone. But the question it posed is not, how many days, how much thirst, how much sun, at what specific measurable point does the architecture of who you are simply stop being the relevant framework? The drought survivors knew the answer. It was 4 days. 4 days of salt water and August sun in the Florida Straits, and the architecture folds. Think about that the next time the sea looks beautiful and manageable and entirely convincingly safe. The Florida Straits carry cruise ships now, enormous floating cities with buffets and entertainment, and every comfort designed to make a person forget they are on water at all. The passengers look out from their balconies at the same stretch of ocean the drought sank in. It is beautiful. It looks like a postcard. It looks like nothing has ever happened there. The water doesn't correct them, it never does. It holds everything that has happened in it with perfect, patient silence, and it lets the next ship pass overhead without a word. 6 men went into it in 1899. 2 came back. The other 4 are still there, in water that is warm and blue and crossed every day by people who have no idea what it keeps. Thank you for making it to the end. Please like and subscribe for horror stories like these every week, shared by real people. Comment below to let me know which story from this video you found more terrifying. Thanks again for supporting the channel.